I bought my parents a house after foreclosure and let them live there rent-free for 8 years. Then they asked me to sign it over to my brother as a wedding gift. So I sold it instead. Posted to r/true off my chest. I need to start by saying something that I think is important context for everything that follows. I do not tell this story as a victim. I made choices throughout the years I am about to describe, choices I believed in at the time, choices I would probably make again given the same information I had when I made them, and choices that ultimately led to an outcome I could not have designed if I had tried. I am not angry, not anymore. What I am is clear. And clarity, in my experience, is worth whatever it costs. This is going to be a long one. Make yourself comfortable. My name is Vivian. I am 39 years old. I have one brother, Marcus, who is 4 years younger than me. Our parents, I will call them Diane and Robert, raised us in a house in a mid-sized city in the southeast, the kind of neighborhood that was working class without being impoverished, the kind of childhood that gave us enough to be grateful for without giving us enough to be curious about money. My parents were not bad people. I want to say that clearly and mean it, because the story I am about to tell does not require them to be villains in order to be true. They love their children in the real and imperfect way that most parents love their children. They worked hard. They made sacrifices I was aware of and probably made others I was not. They were also, in ways that took me a long time to see clearly, people who had some deeply embedded ideas about how family resources should flow, ideas that had never been examined because they had never been challenged. I became the challenge. That is what this story is about. I should also tell you about Marcus. Marcus is my brother, and I love him, and he is also someone who grew up understanding, in the wordless way that children understand family hierarchies, that things tended to work out for him in our household in ways they did not always work out for me. He was the younger one, the boy, the one my mother worried about more visibly, and therefore, in the logic of our family, the one who received more. He was not a bad kid. He is not a bad man. He is a person who is trained by his environment to expect certain things, and who has not yet been sufficiently confronted by the world to understand that those expectations are not automatically valid. I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. The foreclosure happened when I was 28. I had been out of the house for 6 years by then. I left for college, stayed away for work, built a life in a different city that was mine in the way that the first life you build entirely for yourself is irrevocably yours. I was not wealthy, but I was stable. I had a good job in healthcare administration. I had savings. I had the financial discipline that comes from watching your parents struggle with money throughout your childhood and deciding very young that you would not repeat those specific patterns. My parents had been having financial difficulties for several years before the foreclosure. The details are theirs and not entirely mine to share, but the short version is a combination of job loss, medical expenses, and decisions made under pressure that compounded rather than resolved. When my mother called me on a Tuesday morning to tell me they were going to lose the house, she did not ask me for anything directly. She told me the situation.
She cried.
She said she did not know what they were going to do. She said she and my father were too old to start over. She was 53. My father was 55. They were not too old to start over. But I understood what she was saying, and I understood the fear underneath it, and I was 28 years old, and I loved my parents, and I had savings and access to credit, and I thought, I can fix this. I thought it the way young people think things they are capable of doing, with confidence, and without full comprehension of the implications. I did not offer to bail out the existing situation. The foreclosure had gone too far for that. What I did was begin, quietly and over the next several months, to research the housing market in their area, consult with a mortgage broker about what I could qualify for, and eventually put an offer on a 3-bedroom house in a neighborhood I believed would appreciate. The house cost $242,000. My down payment was $40,000, most of my savings. The mortgage payment was just under $1,500 a month. I told my parents what I had done when the offer was accepted. My mother cried again, but differently, the relief kind of crying, which is its own thing entirely, a sound I had not heard from her before. My father said very little, which was his way of saying a great deal. They moved in 3 months after the foreclosure was finalized. The arrangement, as I understood it, was that they would live there rent-free, I would cover the mortgage, while they stabilized. My mother had found part-time work. My father was looking. The idea was that in a few years, once things were more settled, we would revisit the arrangement. I did not put this in writing. I want to be honest about that because it matters later. I did not put any of it in writing because it was family and because I was 28 and optimistic and because it did not occur to me that a document was necessary to protect a kindness I was doing for the people who raised me. Year 1 was fine. Year 2 was fine. Year 3 was when I began to notice things I did not fully name at the time. I noticed that the revisiting I had imagined happening never came up. Not because I was hiding from it. I had simply trusted that my parents would bring it up when they were ready, the way you trust that a natural conversation will occur when the time is right. It did not occur. They were stable by year 2. My father had found work, my mother had increased her hours, Marcus was out of college and living in the city nearby, and beginning his career. The specific crisis that had motivated my decision had passed. But the arrangement had quietly become permanent, in the way that temporary things become permanent when no one discusses them. I also noticed in year 3 and 4 the way the house was discussed in family conversations. My mother would refer to it, casually, as our house. Not as a statement of ownership in a legal sense. I think she understood that the title was in my name and that I held the mortgage, but in the sense of something that had become so thoroughly home to her that the distinction between her home and her daughter's property had dissolved. I did not correct her. I told myself it was a natural thing to say, that she was just comfortable there, that it would be strange and cold to insist on precision in casual family language. I was right that it was natural. What I did not understand yet was that natural and harmless are not the same thing. By year 5, the house was not discussed as my investment or my property at all in family gatherings. It was simply where my parents lived, woven into the fabric of the family as though it had always been theirs, as though the $40,000 down payment and the 8 years of mortgage payments had been contributed by no one in particular, by the general good fortune of a family that had found its footing again. Marcus bought a condo in year 6. He mentioned, at a family dinner, that he had needed to take out a larger loan than expected because he had not had much saved. My mother said something sympathetic. My father said something about how tough the market was. I sat at the table and did not say anything about the $40,000 I had spent at 28 and the $1,500 a month I had been paying ever since, because it did not seem like the moment, and also, if I am honest, because I had developed by that point a practiced habit of not saying certain things at family dinners. That habit had been in formation for years. I had simply not examined it clearly enough to understand what it was protecting me from having to confront. Marcus got engaged in the spring of year 8. Her name is Tanya, and I want to be fair to Tanya. She is pleasant enough, and I do not believe she is the architect of what came next. She is a woman who loves my brother, and my brother arrived in her life having been raised to expect certain accommodations from his family, and I think the demand that followed was his idea dressed in the language of shared decision-making, but I cannot be certain of that, and it is not my story to assign blame within their relationship. The conversation happened in June. My parents had invited me for a weekend visit, framed as a family dinner to celebrate the engagement. I drove 3 hours. I brought wine and flowers for Tanya. I congratulated my brother, and meant it. After dinner, when the celebrating had settled into the comfortable afterglow of a good meal, my father said he wanted to talk about something. He had the expression he got when he was saying something my mother had prepared him to say, a particular careful quality, reading from an internal script. He said that he and my mother had been thinking about Marcus and Tanya's future and about how the family could support them as they started their lives together. He said they would like me to sign the house over to Marcus as a wedding gift. I remember the silence in the room after he said it. Not the dramatic, dropping-pin silence of a confrontation, just a pause in which everyone was waiting for my response, and I was waiting for my own understanding of what I had just heard to catch up with me. I asked him to say that again. He said it again. The house I had bought, the house I had been paying the mortgage on for 8 years, the house my parents had been living in rent-free since I was 28 years old, should be signed over to Marcus as a wedding gift from the family. My mother added, with the smooth assurance of someone who has rehearsed this addition, that Marcus would take over the mortgage payments, of course, so I would be relieved of that responsibility. I sat with this for a long moment. And then I said, I need to think about it. I said this because I did not trust myself to say anything else in that room at that moment with that specific mix of people looking at me with those specific expressions. My mother's expression was the expectant warmth of someone who believes they are asking for something reasonable. My father's was the careful distance of someone delivering a message. Marcus was looking at the table. Tanya was looking at her hands. I said I needed to think about it. I drove home 3 hours in the dark. I thought about it. I will not pretend that I was calm during the drive home or the week that followed. I was not calm. I was the specific kind of not calm that comes from discovering that a narrative you believed you and another person shared has been a different narrative for them all along. That what you understood as a temporary sacrifice born of love had been absorbed into a different story, one in which your contribution was ambient background rather than the entire load-bearing structure. I called my best friend, Celeste, the morning after I got home. Celeste has known me since college. She listened to the full account without interrupting, which took about 40 minutes, and when I was done she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, Vivian, you know what you are going to do. You just need to say it out loud first. She was right. I knew what I was going to do. I needed to say it out loud first. I said, I am not going to sign over the house. Celeste said, good. Now say the rest of it. I said, I am going to sell it. She said, there it is. Before I did anything, I called my parents. I wanted to have the conversation directly, and I wanted to have it before any rumors or secondhand versions circulated through the family, because I had spent too many years watching information move through secondhand channels and had learned that conversations worth having were worth having directly. My mother answered. I told her I had thought carefully about the request, and that I was not able to sign the house over to Marcus. I said it as simply and directly as I could, without preamble, because preamble invites negotiation, and I was not there to negotiate. The response was not simple or direct. My mother said she was very disappointed. She said she had not expected this from me. She said Marcus and Tanya were starting their lives and needed stability. She said I had always had more than Marcus. I had a good job, I had my own apartment, I had built my career, and that this was a chance for me to do something meaningful for my brother. She said the family had supported me too, over the years, in ways that I might not always appreciate. She said she hoped I would reconsider. I said I had considered it fully, and my answer was no. She said she needed to get off the phone. The campaign that followed over the next 3 weeks was, in its way, impressive in its organization. My mother called me 4 times. My father called me twice, which was notable given that he rarely called me at all. Marcus called me once, and that conversation was one of the harder ones, not because he was cruel, but because he was genuinely confused in a way that told me everything about how this had been framed to him. He said he thought this was something I wanted to do. He said Mom had made it sound like I had agreed in principle and was just working out details. I told him that was not accurate and that I was sorry he had been given that impression. He was quiet for a long time and then said he needed to think. Then an uncle I had not spoken to in 2 years called to tell me that family was everything and that I should not let money come between us. Then my mother called again and said she had spoken to an attorney. She did not say what kind or what specifically had been discussed, and that there might be legal considerations given that my parents had been living in the house for 8 years and making contributions to its upkeep. She said she hoped it would not come to that, but she wanted me to know. I want to be honest about my response to that last call. I was frightened by it for about 24 hours. Not because I believed she had a strong legal position. I was on the title. I held the mortgage, I had 8 years of bank statements documenting every payment, but because the threat itself, from my mother, was something I had not expected even in the worst version of how I had imagined this going. A legal threat from a parent to a child who had bought them a house is its own particular kind of loss, separate from any property question, and I needed a day to grieve it before I could do anything else with it. After that day, I called a real estate attorney. Her name was Patricia Holloway, and she was exactly the person I needed in that moment. Direct, precise, and entirely unsentimentally interested in the facts. I laid out the entire situation. The purchase, the title, the mortgage, the 8 years of payments, the rent-free arrangement, the request to sign over, the legal threat. She listened without expression and took detailed notes. When I finished, she asked several specific questions about whether I had any written agreements with my parents, whether my parents had made any direct financial contributions toward the mortgage or property taxes, and whether there were any communications in writing from me indicating that I intended to transfer ownership. I said no to all three. She said, "Your position is straightforward. The property is yours. There is no legal mechanism by which 8 years of rent-free occupancy converts to ownership. The contributions to upkeep, maintenance, minor repairs, do not constitute equity. If your parents pursued any legal action, they would not prevail, and any attorney advising them competently would tell them the same thing." She paused, and then she said, "The question is not what you are legally obligated to do. The question is what you want to do with the asset." I said I wanted to sell it. She said, "Then let's talk about the process. I want to be honest about the family communications during the period when the sale was being prepared, because they were significant, and because I think the honesty matters. I did not announce the sale in advance. I know some people will have opinions about this, that I should have told my parents directly that they deserved notice, that selling without warning was its own form of cruelty. I have sat with that critique and I understand it, and I have decided after considerable thought that I disagree. Here is why. I had already had the conversation about my decision with my mother, clearly and directly. I had said I was not signing over the house. I had not said what I was going to do with it instead, and I was not obligated to announce my plans for my own property to people who had responded to my stated decision with emotional manipulation and legal threats. I gave my parents 60 days' notice to vacate, which was legally required and also, I believe, practically fair. That notice went through the attorney's office. It was formal and it was clear. My mother called me when she received the notice. I will not reproduce that conversation in full because some of it was said in a state of extreme distress, and I do not think reproducing it in full serves anyone. What I will say is that I listened and that I said I was sorry this was painful and that I did not change my position. My father called the day after. He was quieter than my mother. He said he was not sure how they had gotten here. I said I was not either. He asked if there was anything I could do. I said I was selling the house and they would have 60 days from the notice to find somewhere to go. He said okay. He said okay in the way of a man who had run out of arguments and was just receiving what was happening. Marcus did not call again. The house sold for $358,000. I want to pause on that number for a moment because it is the number that represents 8 years of my 20s. 8 years of $1,500 monthly payments. 8 years of maintaining a property I did not live in for a family that had stopped seeing it as mine somewhere along the way. 8 years of not buying my own home because my capital and my credit were committed to this one. After paying off the remaining mortgage balance and the selling costs, agent fees, closing costs, attorney fees, the standard expenses of a property sale, I walked away with $217,000. $217,000. I sat with that number for a long time after the closing. Not with triumph, though there was some of that underneath. Mostly with something that felt like the physical sensation of a weight being lifted from a place you had stopped noticing it was sitting. I had been carrying the mortgage for so long that I had stopped registering it as something I was carrying. When it was gone, the absence was almost vertiginous. Here is what I did with $217,000. I bought myself a house. Not immediately, I took 3 months because I was not going to rush the first property decision I had ever made entirely for myself. I looked carefully. I had conversations with my financial advisor. I thought about what I actually wanted, which turned out to be different from what I had always assumed I would want, because I had spent so many years not thinking about my own desires in this category that I had accumulated a set of received ideas about what I should want rather than a clear understanding of what I actually did. What I actually wanted was a 2-bedroom house with a good kitchen and a yard large enough for a garden, in a neighborhood with actual neighbors, close enough to Celeste that we could see each other without planning a week in advance. I wanted something that was mine in a way that nothing I had owned before had been mine, because the word mine, applied to property, had been complicated for me for 8 years by the knowledge that other people were living in what I owned. I found it in October. $164,000. Small by some measures, exactly right by mine. I put 60,000 down and kept the rest divided between a renovation fund and savings. The renovations were modest and deliberate: a kitchen update, new floors throughout, a back deck that I designed with a friend who does landscape work. I did some of the cosmetic work myself on weekends, which I had not expected to enjoy and which turned out to be one of the more satisfying experiences of the year. There is something about working on something that belongs entirely to you, with your own hands, that is different from every other kind of work. I painted the living room 3 times before I got the color right, and I was not bothered by any of the iterations because they were mine to get wrong. I moved in December. I had a housewarming that Celeste organized because she said I was incapable of throwing a party for myself, and she was not wrong. 20-some people came. My house was full of noise and food, and the specific warmth of people who chose to be there. I stood in my kitchen, with the cabinets I had picked out and the countertops I had debated for 3 weeks, and I felt something I want to try to describe accurately. I felt like I had arrived somewhere I had been trying to reach for a very long time without knowing exactly where I was going. The family situation in the months following the sale was what it was. My parents found an apartment. I do not know the details of how they managed it, whether Marcus helped them, whether they used savings, whether the 60 days was enough, because by that point the channels of family communication had restructured themselves around the fact of what had happened, and I was not on the inside of those channels the way I had been. They were housed. That was what mattered to me. My mother did not speak to me for 4 months after the sale closed. When she eventually called, the conversation was careful in the way of people who are aware of a great deal they are not saying. She did not reference the house. She asked how I was. I said I was well. I said I was happy in my new place. She said that was good. There was a pause, and then she said something I had not expected. She said, "I know we asked too much." She did not elaborate. She did not apologize in a full or formal way. But she said it, and she meant it in the specific way of people who find certain direct admissions very difficult and are giving you the most they currently can. I said I appreciated her saying that. I meant it. We have been in careful contact since then. Phone calls every few weeks. A holiday visit that was short but not terrible. We are, I think, in the process of rebuilding something, not what we had before, because what we had before was not actually as solid as I believed it was, but something more honest. Something in which I am not invisible in the way I was invisible. That rebuilding is slow and not guaranteed to arrive anywhere fully repaired, but it is something, and something is not nothing. Marcus and I have not fully repaired things. He got married in the spring, a small ceremony. I was invited and I went, because he is my brother, and I was not going to punish Tanya for something that was not entirely her doing. I gave them as a wedding gift. A real one, bought with real thought. He thanked me for it briefly, and we have not spoken much since. We exist in the polite, cautious way of people who have a shared history with a difficult chapter in the middle of it, and who have not yet figured out how to talk about that chapter directly. I am leaving space for that conversation when he is ready to have it. I have been thinking about what to say in this final section for a long time, because I do not want to end with a lesson that feels imposed on top of a story that is still ongoing. I do not have everything figured out. The family dynamics are not resolved. The relationship with my parents is in process. Marcus and I are in a careful holding pattern that may or may not lead somewhere better. But here is what I know. I spent 8 years making a sacrifice that I believed was temporary and that became permanent through the slow accumulation of silence and assumption and normalized expectation. I made that sacrifice out of love, and the love was real, and the sacrifice was real, and neither of those things made the demand at the end of it appropriate. Real love does not cancel the debt it owes you. Real sacrifice does not require you to keep sacrificing indefinitely until someone decides you have given enough. The people who most need you to believe otherwise are the people who most benefit from your not knowing where your limits are. I do not say that bitterly. I say it as a fact I had to locate through experience, the same way I had to locate through experience what kind of house I actually wanted, and what color I actually wanted my living room, and what my own life looked like when it was organized around my own priorities rather than the needs of a family system that had never been asked to account for what it was asking. I walked away from $217,000 worth of sacrifice, and I built a house and a garden and a life that is mine. Some people called that selfish. Some still do. I have sat with that characterization long enough to have an answer to it. Selfish is when you take something that belongs to someone else. What I did was stop giving away what belonged to me. Those are different things. Learning the difference, learning it in your body, not just in your head, is one of the hardest and most important things I have ever done. The garden is coming in well this spring. I planted tomatoes for the first time. I have no idea what I am doing. I am enjoying every minute of it. Update: posted 7 months after the original post. I did not expect to come back here. The original post felt complete in the way that writing something out and closing the document feels complete, like you have set something down and do not need to pick it up again. But enough happened in the months since that I want to add it because some of you reached out asking how things had progressed, and because one thing in particular feels like it belongs to the story. The house. Thriving. The back deck was finished in April, and I have eaten dinner outside on it approximately 40 times since, which, given that I spent most of my adult years in apartments with no outdoor space, feels almost reckless. The tomatoes are growing with an enthusiasm that I find personally validating. Celeste has been over enough times that she has a dedicated coffee mug with her name on it, which she claims is unnecessary and which she uses every single time. My mother and I had a longer conversation in March, one of those phone calls that runs longer than either of you planned because you keep not being done. She talked about growing up, about her own mother's relationship with money and how it had shaped her, about the way she had passed patterns to her children that she had not examined in herself first. She did not do this perfectly. There were moments where the accountability drifted toward explanation, and I had to let it be explanation rather than holding out for the version that acknowledged harm more cleanly. But she stayed in the conversation. She did not get off the phone when it got uncomfortable. That is new, and I am choosing to receive it as meaningful. My father called me on my birthday. He said happy birthday and asked about the house, and listened while I talked about the deck and the tomatoes and the kitchen project I was considering for next year. He laughed at something I said in a way that sounded like himself, not the careful, scripted version of himself from the difficult months. I laughed too. Marcus sent me a message in May. A text, not a call. It said, "I've been thinking. I owe you a real conversation. Not ready yet, but I will be." I replied, "I'll be here." I meant it. That is where things are. And here is the thing I most want to add, the one that arrived recently, and that I have been sitting with since. A woman at my workplace, a colleague I know well enough to eat lunch with occasionally, but not well enough to know her full family history, mentioned in passing that she was thinking about helping her parents with a financial situation. She described it briefly. The shape of it was familiar in ways that made me very still. I told her some of what I had been through. Not all of it. We were at lunch, not a therapy session, but enough. I said, "Make sure whatever you do is in writing. Make sure the terms are clear to everyone involved. Make sure you understand the difference between a gift and a loan, and that everyone understands it the same way. Make sure you are doing it from love and not from guilt, because those things feel identical from the inside and have completely different consequences." She looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Did you learn this the hard way?" I said yes. She said, "Thank you for telling me. That is why I write things down. That is why I told this story at all. Not for the satisfaction of a completed arc or the vindication of a difficult decision, but for the woman at lunch who needed someone to have learned it the hard way already, so she did not have to. I am glad I did it. The learning, I mean. And the garden.